There's a moment in narcissistic relationships that breaks people emotionally more than almost anything else. It's not the screaming, not the manipulation, not even the betrayal. It's the moment you finally needed real love, and suddenly they disappeared emotionally. Not physically at first, emotionally. You became overwhelmed, exhausted, anxious, heartbroken, and instead of moving closer to you, the narcissist pulled away. That moment creates a kind of confusion that's incredibly hard to explain to people who haven't lived it. Because love is supposed to become stronger. When vulnerability appears, closer, safer, more emotionally present. But narcissistic relationships often move in the opposite direction. The more emotionally needy you become, the colder they become. And that contradiction destroys people internally. Because now, you start blaming yourself for having emotional needs at all. You become quieter emotionally, smaller emotionally, more careful emotionally, trying desperately not to become too much. But here's what most people don't understand initially. Narcissists are often deeply attracted to emotional admiration, but emotionally uncomfortable with authentic vulnerability, especially sustained vulnerability, because admiration feels empowering, neediness feels demanding, and emotionally healthy love requires tolerating both. That's why narcissistic relationships often feel incredible during idealization. At first, they seem emotionally obsessed with you, attentive, intense, present. They study you emotionally, mirror you emotionally, make you feel deeply seen. And for a while, it feels like the safest connection you've ever experienced, because narcissists often create intense emotional fusion early on. You feel chosen, special, irreplaceable, and emotionally, that feeling becomes addictive quickly. But here's the hidden problem. The relationship was often built around emotional stimulation, not emotional endurance, and those are very different things. Because stimulation thrives on excitement, novelty, admiration, fantasy. But emotional endurance requires patience, consistency, empathy, presence during discomfort. And this is where narcissistic relationships usually start changing. Because eventually, real life enters the relationship. Stress, pain, anxiety, loss, depression, emotional exhaustion. And suddenly, the emotional dynamic shifts completely. Now you're not just providing emotional admiration anymore. You need emotional support too. And this is where many narcissists begin emotionally withdrawing. Not always consciously, not always intentionally cruel, but psychologically, emotional caregiving can feel overwhelming to them, especially if it threatens their emotional comfort or control. That's why so many survivors describe the same painful realization. The moment I needed them most, they became someone else, colder, irritated, emotionally distant, impatient with your pain, and sometimes almost annoyed by your vulnerability. That reaction feels devastating emotionally, because now your pain doesn't just hurt, it feels rejected. And rejected vulnerability creates deep emotional shame, especially when you once felt emotionally safe with that person. That's why many people become trauma bonded more intensely after emotional abandonment. Because now they're chasing the return of emotional safety that disappeared suddenly, trying harder, explaining more, suppressing emotions more, hoping the loving version returns again. But here's what most people miss during this phase. The narcissist often didn't lose interest because you became less lovable. They lost interest because the relationship stopped revolving around emotional gratification alone. Now, emotional responsibility entered the relationship, and emotional responsibility often activates discomfort inside narcissistic dynamics because emotionally supportive relationships require mutuality. And narcissists often struggle sustaining mutual emotional focus consistently. That's why emotional imbalance slowly grows over time. At first, your feelings mattered deeply. Later, your feelings became inconvenient. And this shift feels psychologically brutal because the contrast between the beginning and the end becomes impossible to reconcile emotionally. You keep thinking, how can someone who once loved me this intensely become this emotionally detached? But intensity and emotional depth are not always the same thing. And that realization changes everything because narcissistic love often feels emotionally intense without being emotionally stable. And unstable love changes dramatically when emotional demands increase. That's why many narcissists pull away emotionally during moments that should create closeness. Illness, grief, depression, pregnancy, stress, family problems, emotional burnout, moments where authentic support becomes necessary. And instead of emotional intimacy increasing, the narcissist becomes emotionally absent, sometimes subtly, sometimes completely. And this emotional abandonment creates enormous confusion internally. Because now, you start feeling guilty for needing comfort at all. You begin minimizing your pain, hiding your emotions, apologizing for your vulnerability, just trying not to push them further away emotionally. But emotionally healthy love doesn't punish vulnerability, it moves toward it. That's one of the clearest differences survivors eventually recognize, because healthy relationships usually deepen emotionally during hardship. Narcissistic relationships often destabilize during hardship instead. And this next part is where many people lose themselves completely. Because eventually you stop asking for emotional support altogether. You become emotionally self-contained, careful, hyper-aware, trying not to create emotional inconvenience. And slowly, you abandon yourself emotionally to keep the relationship alive. That's why narcissistic relationships create such profound emotional exhaustion. Because over time, your emotional world becomes organized around managing their reactions, not expressing your reality honestly. And emotional suppression changes people deeply. You stop feeling emotionally safe. You stop trusting your own needs. You stop believing you deserve care consistently. Because every vulnerable moment became associated with withdrawal, coldness, distance, punishment, and eventually, you start interpreting your own emotions as burdens. That psychological damage lasts long after the relationship ends, because emotional neglect changes identity slowly, especially when it comes from someone who once felt emotionally loving. That's why the beginning of narcissistic relationships becomes so haunting afterward, because survivors keep comparing the loving version to the emotionally absent version later, trying desperately to understand which one was real. But both versions were real emotionally in different moments. That's what makes the cycle so confusing. The affection existed, the intensity existed, but emotional consistency didn't. And consistency is what determines emotional safety long term. Not intensity, not chemistry, not obsession, consistency. And narcissists often struggle maintaining emotional consistency when relationships become emotionally demanding. That's why the emotional withdrawal feels so shocking, because the shift can happen gradually, almost invisibly, First, they become less emotionally responsive, then less patient, then more irritated, then emotionally unavailable entirely. And by the time you fully recognize the change, you're already emotionally starving inside the relationship. That's why survivors often say, "I felt alone while still being with them." Because emotional abandonment can exist inside relationships long before physical separation happens. And emotional abandonment creates desperation because humans naturally seek reconnection after emotional distance appears. That's why many people become more attached after the narcissist becomes colder, not less attached. Because now, your brain starts chasing emotional restoration constantly, trying to recover the closeness that disappeared. And intermittent affection strengthens that attachment even more. Sometimes they become warm again briefly, present again briefly, affectionate again briefly, just enough to restore hope emotionally. And hope keeps people inside painful cycles longer than almost anything else. Because hope says, maybe the loving version is coming back permanently. But temporary warmth doesn't erase chronic emotional neglect. And eventually, many survivors realize something devastating. The relationship only felt emotionally safe when their needs stayed minimal. That realization hurts deeply because now you understand the relationship had emotional conditions attached. You could be adored, desired, pursued, as long as emotional reciprocity stayed limited. But once you needed sustained support, the narcissist emotionally retreated. An emotional retreat during vulnerability changes relationships permanently because trust collapses. Now you no longer feel emotionally held. You feel emotionally tolerated, and tolerated love never feels safe. That's why healing after narcissistic abuse requires relearning something important. Your emotional needs were never the problem. The problem was being inside a relationship where your needs activated emotional withdrawal instead of connection. And once survivors understand that, the shame slowly begins disappearing. Because many people leave narcissistic relationships believing they were too emotional, too needy, too sensitive, too demanding. But healthy love does not disappear when someone needs support. Healthy love adapts, communicates, shows up consistently, even imperfectly. And this realization becomes incredibly healing later, because eventually, you stop seeing your vulnerability as weakness. You stop apologizing for needing comfort. You stop shrinking emotionally to keep someone from pulling away, and you begin recognizing something powerful. The narcissist often lost interest the moment the relationship stopped serving emotional gratification exclusively. Because emotional intimacy requires mutual emotional responsibility, and mutual responsibility is difficult for emotionally self-centered dynamics to sustain long-term. That's why the relationship changed once your pain became visible. Not because your pain made you less lovable, but because your vulnerability required emotional depth they couldn't maintain consistently. And once you understand that, their withdrawal stops defining your worth emotionally. Now you see the truth differently. You weren't abandoned because you became too hard to love. You were abandoned emotionally because the relationship could not sustain authentic intimacy once emotional needs
You
became
never
real.
listen to Mimi.
And that
Because you're always
realization
lying.
I'm not
changes
lying.
everything.
Then prove it.
Because now, you stop chasing people who disappear when vulnerability appears. You stop measuring love through emotional intensity alone. You stop confusing obsession with emotional safety. And slowly you begin understanding what real love actually feels like. Not dramatic, not emotionally unstable, not disappearing when life gets difficult, but present, consistent, emotionally available, especially when you need it most. And once you experience that kind of love, you finally realize something heartbreaking about the narcissistic relationship. They loved being needed emotionally, but struggled loving you when you needed them back.